going to go. Okay, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Today's lesson is on Messianic Jewish foundations as well as Yeshua and the Talmud. I kind of kicked ahead of it, but I'm going to refresh and reread. So far, I didn't get too far ahead of myself here, so I apologize for that. So let's start from the top. Okay. Okay, so the original followers of Jesus didn't call themselves Christians. That name came later and not from them. In Acts 11:26, it says the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch and called by whom? Not by the apostles, not by Jesus. It was by the outsiders that called them. But when Paul talks about the believers, he calls them the saints, the faithful, the assembly, but never Christians. So keep that in mind. So if you think that word defines the faith or our faith, you may be starting from the wrong spot. Today's billions around the world identify as Christians. Churches bear the name. Nations have been shaped by it. Wars have been fought over and continue to do so. But let's say we pause for a moment and ask the simple question. Did the first followers of Yeshua, known in English as Jesus, ever use that word for themselves? The answer is surprisingly clear, and it might shape some of your assumptions. So let's first start with only one verse in the New Testament that directly tells us when this word first appeared. So Acts 11:26, it says, the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch. And at first glance, that may seem straightforward. But as always, let's look again at that verse. It says they were called Christians, not that they called themselves Christians, okay? We're called many names, but we don't embrace those names now, do we? Right? Okay, so keep that in mind. So this is a play on words. Just because they were called it didn't mean that they accepted the term, okay? This was oftentimes known from the Romans in particular as a derogatory statement. So the phrase is passive. It describes what others called them, not what they chose, not what Yeshua commanded, not what the apostles taught. It begs the question, who called them Christians? I already gave it away a little bit, but the context gives us a clue. This happened in Antioch, a major Roman city far from Jerusalem, far from the Jewish heart of the early movement. We're by a busy street here, so there's a lot of ambulances going on, unfortunately. Scholars widely agree that the term was likely coined by outsiders, Romans or Greeks observing this new Jewish sect and labeling them based on the one thing that stood out. Christ, right? Okay, so the constant talk about the Messiah, the Christ, the word Christian in Greek is Christos, literally meaning one who belongs to Christ. But there's the irony. For those early Jewish followers of Yeshua, Christ wasn't just a name, it was a title. It was a reputational name, a Hebrew one, in fact. It comes from Mashiach, which means anointed one in the Hebrew culture. The Mashiach referred to the promised king descended from David, who would redeem Israel and establish God's kingdom on earth. When those first believers talked about Yeshua as the Christ, they weren't using a new theological term. They knew very well what they were saying. They were checking him, or declaring him, to be the Jewish Messiah, the one foretold by Moses, Isaiah, and the prophets. Now, here's the problem. Over time, the term Christian began to mean something different, as with everything in our lexicon. One word may start like this, it may mean this to one generation, it evolves to another. You've seen this in many, many cases, especially with the English language alone. So it became detached from its Jewish roots. Surprise. It began to refer to a new religion, something separate from Israel, something that with its own traditions, its own theology, its own holidays, and sadly, often its own hostility toward the very people from whom the Messiah came from. The irony is delicious. But that's not how it started. when Paul the apostle to the nations wrote to the communities of believers, he never once used the word Christian. Keep that in mind. Not in Romans, not in Corinthians, not in Galatians, nor Ephesians, or Philippians, or Thessalonians for that matter. It was never referenced as such. Okay? So instead, he referred to the believers in key words, the saints, meaning the holy ones set apart for God. In Romans 1:7, to all who are in Rome, beloved of God, called to be saints, the faithful, meaning those who trusted in the message. So in Ephesians 1:1, the saints who are in Ephesus and faithful in Christ Jesus. The assembly, ecclesia in this case, a gathering, a community often used in Septuagint, which is a translate of Kahal, the assembly of Israel. And the Septuagint, for those of you who may or may not know, is the earliest extended Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, and it is derived from the original Hebrew. So 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 2, the church of God, which is at Corinth. Well, hey, this is snap, right? Why are we talking about this? So because these were not people who saw themselves as leaving Judaism to start something new. They were Jews and Gentiles who joined them and who believed that Yeshua was the fulfillment of Israel's hope. They were, in essence, Messianic Jews, us, those Jews who believed that the Messiah had already come. And the Gentiles who joined them were grafted in not a new religion, but into the commonwealth of Israel. This is really, really important to call out. So in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 12 through 13, hear the word.
You were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel. But now in Christ Jesus, you who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ.
Amen. It's a powerful statement right there in Ephesians. So this brings us to an important word, Messianic. In Hebrew, the followers of Yeshua who embraced his identity as the Messiah would be called Notzvim Mashiachim. So in other words, Messianic believers. They didn't reject the Torah or the Sabbath or the God of Israel. They embraced all of it more deeply through the lens of the Messiah. So our reading is from Acts 24, verse 14.
But this I confess to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, so I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets.
Thank you for that. So unfortunately, by the time the church fathers, men like Justin, Martyr, Origen, and Augustine, the gap between Christianity and the Jewish foundation had widened dramatically, unfortunately. Sabbath was replaced with Sunday. Passover was replaced with Easter. The Jewish people were cast as Christ killers. Can you imagine? Just them who were responsible for his death. Never mind humanity. And the term Christian became not just a label, but often a weapon, right? And that's how it is pretty much today. It hasn't changed much, right? So that history matters. It affects how we read scripture, how we see Yeshua, and how we define faith. So why does this label matter today? Because if we start from the wrong foundation, we may end up building something that looks very different from what you should have intended, right? Or you should have intended. So again, this is the evolution of this faith system and how it branched off, divided, split up, and we're still continuing to do it to this day. Okay, there's no reconciliation. This is a problem. We need to revisit this. This is why we're here. So he didn't come to start a new religion. He came to fulfill the promises of God to Israel and to open the gates of that kingdom to the nations. A reading from John 4:22.
Salvation is of the Jews. Romans 11, Verse 1, did God cast away people? Certainly not, for I also am an Israelite.
Amen. So, before we go down the path to define ourselves by a word that wasn't theirs, instead maybe we should ask, what did they believe? How did they live? What did they call themselves? The early believers didn't need a new name. So, as we wrap up here, they had a mission. They had a calling. They were of a covenant. It's a little easier in my honesty. They saw themselves as a faithful remnant of Israel and as the first fruits of a global harvest. But let's not forget the gospel didn't begin in Rome. It didn't begin in Europe. It didn't begin in a church building or at councils or cathedrals. It began outside. Okay? It began in Jerusalem with the Jewish men and women who followed their Jewish Messiah. And when the nations came in, they were not invited to erase that story, but to become part of it. So if you believe in Yeshua, the Jewish Messiah, ask yourself, are you following him as he truly is, or are you following a version that history edited? The word Christian isn't wrong, but it isn't original. Perhaps now is the time to rediscover the original language of faith, not just in words, but in heart, identity, and mission, I dare say mind. Because at the end of the day, the truth is still unfiltered, and this is what we presented to you today. That concludes our first part of our lesson. Any questions with that before I go on? All right. So this lesson is on Yeshua in the Talmud. So this second part of this study, I think you guys are going to find especially interesting. And truthfully, I need to do more reading in the Talmud. There is a beautiful amount of wisdom in the Talmud, and this is just one example of it. And as we explore a little bit further on this, I'd love to take this into a deep dive, but even just scraping the surface is just eye-opening in itself. So let's go ahead and get started here. So from an overview perspective, the mainstream academic and rabbinic scholars typically do not recognize Ba-Peretz 60b as a direct reference to Yeshua. Let me be clear on that. They are more commonly cited the Talmudic reference to Yeshua, which appears in other tractates like the Sanhedrin 43a. However, the intent of the study is to provide further analysis as to why this is the case and for defense as to why it requires to be re-examined. The findings of this research, as some rabbis within the Orthodox circle, as a result, have begun to reevaluate as a result of the research by Rabbi Joseph Shulam, which is the nature of this portion of our study today. To give you a little bit of background on Rabbi Shulam, Joseph Shulam was born in Sofia, Bulgaria. He was born on March 24th, 1946. His family immigrated to Israel in 1948, where they settled in Jerusalem. In 1962, he came to faith in Yeshua the Messiah. He was educated at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, where he received his bachelor's in Bible and Bible archaeology. This man is a reference for Messianic study. He is the go-to person, and many of the ultra-Orthodox actually ask him questions. So he is a sage of reference. He's a good researcher. And this little peeling of research that I did is a larger portion of his research, which we could go on much. There'll be another dissertation with that, because it's deeply fascinating. So, but I digress. So let's take a look at it in more detail, what I'm talking about here. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background here. And you can see the Hebrew up on top, and you can see the translation down below. And I'll read this to you. So, and from the day the wicked kingdom, i.e. Rome, spread who decree evil and harsh decrees upon us and nullify Torah, study and the performance of the mitzvot for us, and do not allow us to enter the celebration of the first week of the sun. In other words, circumcision. And some say to enter the salvation of a firstborn son. Now, for those of you who are familiar with this this tradition here, with the temple missing, oftentimes when the firstborn child, the son, was born, there was the ritual, if you will, where they would place the child on a platter and put ornate, it's like gold and silver along that. So the whole idea was to purchase him back from the Kohen as part of that effort. So I wanted to give you a little bit of background just so you have that foundation, okay? That kind of coincides with the statement around circumcision, because they're looking at the firstborn of the circumcision process, okay? This is where the schism happened, so I'll explore this in a little more detail. So if we look at the original text within the Talmud and just look at it from a translation standpoint, just from the top, the very statement begins with Jesus or Yeshua the Son. This is from the Talmud. Okay, so they call that out. And this is where the basis of this research is really beginning from. Okay, so Joshua ben Pethahiah and his disciple, who was supposed to be Yeshua, Jesus, and other texts, but this text here in the Ba-Peretz, page 60, I never encountered this until I saw that Rabbi Shalom first presented. So this day of destruction of the temple, we should be by right bind ourselves not to eat meat or drink wine. We're in mourning, if you will. Only we do not lay hardship on the community unless the majority can endure it. And from that day, a government has come into power, which issues cruel decrees against us and forbids us from the observance of Torah and the precepts that does not allow us to enter into the week of the Son, according to another version, the salvation of the Son. Okay? This is where we get kind of hung up on the words. Okay, this is back where I was telling you there is either a noun or a verb. So bear with me so they make a little bit more sense. So we ought by right to bind ourselves not to marry and to get children, and the seed of Abraham, our father, will come to an end into itself. That's the English translation of the text with what we do after the destruction of the temple. How to show our grief, our sorrow for the destruction of the temple. Okay, so we have that precept. So Rabbi Ishmael first says we shouldn't eat meat or drink wine because these are the customs of happy days of celebration. So we see the destruction of the temple. There's none of that, permitted. So we are in mourning at this point, and in the time of mourning, we shouldn't eat meat or drink wine, but we can't bind on the public in Israel something that they cannot endure. So we can't take it too hard. There can't be too much hardship, but there should be hardship. In other words, right? So the evil kingdom that forbids us from observing the Torah and keeping the commandments is binding us. It is forbidding us to celebrate the commandments of God and enter into the week of the Son. Okay, but now we've established that. So the week of the Son, say to yourself, Yeshua the Son. Okay, but the English translation doesn't translate it very well. It puts in brackets and says, according to another version, take note of that, the salvation of the Son. But salvation translates in Hebrew to Yeshua. Okay, see where I'm going. And Yeshua is also the name of a person. Salvation being the verb, also being the noun. Get it now. So Yeshua is the name of a person. Yeshua is a noun. A garoon. Okay, now a garoon, to give you some background of that, a form that is derived from a verb that functions as a noun. So in English, it's like an ending in ing, of asking. Do you mind my asking you? Okay, so that's an example of like a garoon. So I want to just give that background because it's been a long time since I heard that term. And I don't take English class as much as I used to. I'm not in elementary school. So that being, so we have that established. And now I lost the place here. So Yeshua is the name of a person. Yeshua is a noun and a garoon in English grammar. So they say in another version it says, but actually the best version of Talmud in Hebrew and Aramaic, the official, the Venetian, and other versions say Yeshua the Son. And it doesn't say the salvation of the Son, but Yeshua the Son. And I showed you that translation earlier that denotes that, right? So many Orthodox Jews don't understand as a result of that because they don't understand. They're forbidden to explore Yeshua. It's Just doesn't make any sense to them, right? Okay, because it's forbidden to explore that of Yeshua. It's almost like a curse from their eyes. So Rashi says it's talking about circumcision, but circumcision doesn't happen in a week. Okay, in the 7 days, circumcision happened on the 8th day. Okay, not 7 days. Okay, so the whole determination lining it with circumcision is not quite accurate. Okay, so bear with me. So, and Rashi taking it out of concept to say that the week of the sun is the week of the circumcision, but again, they changed the text from a name of a person to a gerun, to a noun that is not in the context of the story itself. The general context of the chapter, in fact, that deals with what to do. So another interesting thing to point out is that in this text, it is the suggestion that during this time of the destruction, they shouldn't marry and have children, right? So this is really interesting because the rabbi that object to the New Testament, that object to Yeshua, actually condemned Paul for what he says in the 1 Corinthians chapter 7, that people shouldn't marry because of the times, the difficulty of the times. But here we have Rabbi Ishmael suggesting that the same thing is in the Talmud, but because of the difficulty of the time, people shouldn't marry and have children. This is exactly what Paul was stating. It's the same thing, okay? But it came in from a different context. So, as we find out in another tractate of the Talmud, the Sanhedrin on page 97 and 98, there's 7 days that each day brings another calamity and another disaster on the world. Does that sound familiar? Sometimes hunger, sometimes earthquakes, sometimes other great problems on the world. During 7 days before the appearance of the Son of David, of the Messiah. Okay, and now if you start to think of Revelations, that's good intuition on your part. So take note, as it's validated here, it's 1 week of tribulations. Okay? So what is interesting in the book of Revelation has the same thing, right? 1 week of tribulation. Each day, another angel pours another cup of sorrow, of suffering, of disaster on the world. But it's same as the Talmud. But the book of Revelation is at least 200 years before the Babylonian Talmud even existed. Even before the Jerusalem Talmud came into being. So it's fascinating. We've got 7 days. Each day, another angel pours out another calamity on the world. And we have the same thing in the tractate of the Sanhedrin. Okay. So the week of the sun is the week before the sun appears, before the son of David appears. And the same thing is in the Talmud, the tractate of Sanhedrin, and in the book of Revelation, and in the same phrase, the week that the son of David will appear. That's the calamity that are supposed to happen. The context is very interesting and connected with the destruction of the temple. But what's more interesting is what it says, Yeshua ha-ben, Yeshua is the Son. Okay? Thank you, Talmud, for validating that. And that's in the Talmud. That's why the Sensino English translation doesn't translate it and says in another version, the salvation of the Son. They changed the word Yeshua to Yeshua with the hua at the end, and they reinterpreted it as the salvation of the Son, based on the influence of Rashi's interpretation. So Rashi lived in the early medieval period of Europe, in the city of Worms that was part of France, which is now part of Germany. Now I believe it's part of Frankfurt. So it's a bit intriguing text, but it's not the only text. So let's expand on this here. So the old prayer books, the Sidurim, that were used in the Orthodox world, on Rosh Hashanah, it said that Metatron, the angel that is sitting next to the throne of God, is Yeshua. They changed there too to say the same thing. They put Hua in the first, in its first, and made it Yeshua. And then then it makes sense to them. Because the angel name is not Yeshua, but Yeshua. And that's how it was spelled in the Siddur. Okay. And then we have Yom Kippur, Matzot Rosh Hashanah, the first Machzor, Yom Kippur second. We have then before Genesis happened, before the creation of the world. Also a very messianic text connected within Isaiah 53, another prophetic text related to the Messiah. So what am I trying to say? Essentially, what I'm trying to apply here is that in the early days of history of Israel, after the destruction of the temple, Yeshua was not a stranger. He was very well known. So when Christianity was born later in the late second or third, beginning of the fourth century, then the enmity set into a bitter competition, a bitter persecution between the Christian and the Jews. And that hatred, that persecution bore a negation, a contradiction between the disciples of Yeshua, so-called disciples of Yeshua, right? That means the Christians on the second, third, or fourth century and the Jewish community. So the alienation happened after Bar Kokhba rebellion. So this, for those of you not familiar with Bar Kokhba rebellion, we're going to go into that here. So, but before the Bar Kokhba rebellion, take me a little while to get that. Rabbi Ishmael says the week of the Son, meaning that the week of the tribulations, and identified the Son as Yeshua the Son. That's the amazing text. A lot more has to be studied about it and research, of course. But I just want you to be aware that the early years of the destruction of the temple, the relationship with the rabbinical world and the Pharisaic world, and Yeshua and his disciples was not such deep alienation and such deep negation until well in the beginning of the second century when Rabbi Akiva and that generation of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. So between that time, Messianic Jews were much more accepted, but a few centuries later, there's just rejection from both sides. So as we wrap up, we have a historical document to support this, written by Bar Kokhba himself, where he says, you know, get the Galileans, which is another name for the disciples of Yeshua. Get the Galileans, put them in chains. The reason is the disciples of Yeshua did not join the second rebellion. So they wanted to, you know, incarcerate them as a result. So why is that? They did not join the first rebellion. But the reason they didn't join the second rebellion is because Rabbi Akiva declared that Bar Kokhba, the Messiah, and the disciples of Yeshua knew that Bar Kokhba was not the Messiah. And that brought great calamity and finally the exile of the Jews from Judea to Galilee. And from there, they're over to the rest of the Roman Empire. So this deeply intriguing text that I just wanted to share with you. So the week of the Son, Yeshua is the son of the Talmud, the rabbinical literature, and something that for us to ponder way more carefully. But again, as always, you know, these are readings. We have to, you know, I can present you the truth, but oftentimes we have to read it on our own. We have to validate, we have to take this in, we have to discern. And I would encourage you to do so because again, this is very revealing, and this is a very argumentative position here. But at the same time, when we do the proper translation, you see the great reveal, even within the Talmud. So that concludes my lessons for today. And thank you for your time, your patience, and your interest. Shalom and Yeshua.